Ontario is reporting 409 new COVID-19 cases, and Quebec just said they have 582 new cases, continuing this trend of seeing the number of cases go up. We know that there are new directives from Ontario that say low-risk asymptomatic individuals should not get testing. But we're going to try and break this all down, and hopefully to explain a little more on this, I'm joined by Raywat Deonandan. He's an epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Raywat, I'm not sure how much you were listening in to that briefing in Toronto at Queen's Park by Ontario health officials. What do you make of this new directive? They're telling people who want to go in to get tested, if they don't have any real symptoms or haven't been in contact with anyone that they know of with COVID-19, they should not line up and get a test. What do you make of that, and how much do you know about it right now?
So there's a lot to unpack there. There's a huge testing backlog, as I think everyone understands. And if you open the doors too widely, we won't get through the symptomatic people who need it the most. Epidemiologically, it's a bit challenging because we have to do surveillance testing as well as clinical testing. The problem here is we don't have sufficient testing capacity. And so we're rolling in the surveillance testing, the screening testing, in with the clinical. And that's a disaster. So until we get enough capacity to do sufficient surveillance testing, we have to reserve these diagnostic tests for the symptomatic cases. It's the right move, unfortunately.
It is, hey? I mean, when you think about it, you hear about these cases of asymptomatic people spreading COVID-19 and they don't even know it. So how does that work? I mean, what do you say, and how do you assure Canadians who are in that boat?
Right. So epidemiologically, there's something to be said for how much we presume you are infected before you get the test. It's called a positive predictive value. Let's go into the woods about this. But if we have no reason to suspect you might be infected, then there's a fairly high chance of getting a false positive on the test. We have to do the test over and over again. So we need new tools to do that kind of surveillance testing. The rapid test, the saliva test, things with different thresholds of acceptance. So it sounds like we're investigating these new tools so we can deploy quicker and cheaper, and reserve the PCR testing for the ones that we need to do right now to make sure we get those truly symptomatic and infectious cases off the table as quickly as possible.
Okay. Well, having testing at pharmacies helps, since they are for appointment only and non-symptomatic people.
Yeah, so it will help. The problem there is it doesn't really address the real backlog. It would be great if the pharmacies could be used as well to get some of these symptomatic testing, but then you'd have to deploy some other kinds of hygiene control measures in the pharmacy lineups. I understand they're going to be used mostly for people who need the test for work purposes, and that's great. What we're trying to do is avoid having that capacity used up by people who are just kind of curious, who want to visit a loved one or something. Reassurance testing is sometimes called. There's a role for that, but this capacity should not be used for that, especially given the lab capacity also needs to be surged up. And opening up more testing centers does not address the slowness of getting the results back if we don't also increase the capacity to do the tests in the lab.
Next hour, the Premier will announce the next pillar for the fall pandemic plan. 38 healthcare leaders and physicians have signed a letter calling on the government to, quote, and we're going to take a look at it right here on your screens, immediately place restrictions on non-essential businesses and activities that facilitate social gatherings and increase opportunities for exposure, including dine-in restaurants and bars, nightclubs, gyms, theaters, and places of worship. You advised on this letter. Why do you think these steps are so important?
Okay, so I was party to an offline conversation that led to this letter advising, so the word I'd use necessarily. But what we're seeing is an increase in cases at an explosive rate. And we have every reason to expect that this will be followed by an increase in hospitalization usage and probably an increase in death as well. It might not, but it probably will. And so when we see those increases, it will be too late to enact measures that will save the most lives. If we act now, we have a much better chance of preventing that kind of scenario. So we learned from the earlier part of this pandemic that early action saves lives. Let's put some of that learning to action and do the right thing now. We know that the super spreading events must be curtailed, and they are in bars, in nightclubs, karaoke bars, strip clubs, a little bit in restaurants. Restaurants is a touchy one, I understand. But if we can avoid those kinds of opportunities, then we have a good chance of keeping schools open, which should be a priority, and preventing an explosive resurgence of this disease in ways that exceed the first wave.
That's what I was going to ask. You answered it right there about schools. A lot of people wondering if they should be closed down, but it should be priority from what I'm hearing, from what you're saying. CBC has learned that the province is planning a more targeted approach with specific regions and businesses. In Ontario, that's happening. Why does this not go far enough, though, in your view?
Well, it depends what the targeted means. You can target specific businesses or sectors, which would be great. I'm not comfortable with saying everyone needs to work from home. I think targeting those sectors that are known to be opportunities for super spreading events like bars and nightclubs is a good way to start. Moving university classes entirely online right now is a good way to go as well. There's no need for many of those classes to be open. I'm not sure why they are, frankly. So what we want to do is avoid the need for a full-on economic lockdown. We learned from the first time that there are smarter ways of doing this. There's no reason that a low incidence region of the province needs to be punished because a high incidence region is experiencing a resurgence of this disease. There's no reason that certain sectors of the economy need to be punished or closed if they don't need to be. So as long as we have these measures deployed, like the mask wearing and the distancing, things we didn't have back in March, I think we have a good chance of keeping this under control to the extent that we do not need a full lockdown.
What do you hope to hear from Ontario Premier Doug Ford next hour?
I hope to hear a commitment to proactive action, not reactive action. And proactive action means listening to the experts who say, in a few weeks, we expect these hospitalizations numbers to increase. Right? Sounds like he is listening to that message in general. So closing the bars, number one. Providing financial support for these closed businesses is critical. Recognizing that there's certain demographics that need to be targeted isn't the right word, but supported in a better way. BIPOC communities, low-income communities, crowded communities need special help in allowing themselves to protect themselves and their loved ones. And we need better targeted messaging and a whole suite of new tools for addressing a certain demographic. I mean, younger people, to get them on board with the self-restraint needed to curtail the transmission of this disease. So far, that's been a failing endeavor, and we need more resources and a diversity of messaging tools deployed to achieve that end.
Before I let you go, I mean, we did hear from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau yesterday calling this a second wave, although when you look at certain regions, it's a bit debatable for some. What do you say? Are we there, or is this just a ripple?
So first of all, the disease looks differently in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. It's not one disease, it's many epidemics with many manifestations. The term wave is unscientific. It implies there's something innate about the disease that cycles through according to the seasons, and it implies that if we just wait this out, it'll go away. It's a resurgence, meaning that it responds to human behavior. And to the extent that we have behaved a certain way, that is, we have opened up our economy, perhaps more quickly than we should have, the disease has resurged in a way that resembles the first part of a new wave. So yes, that's my equivocal way of saying it looks like what we would call a second wave in most of Canada, yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for breaking it down for us. Appreciate this.
My pleasure. Thank you.